Margaery Tyrell's slippered steps echoed across the marble floors of the great September of Baelor, each tap as delicate as the brush of a rose petal. Yet within her chest, her heart hammered with equal fervor, for she knew that her steps this day would lead her down a path that none among the Tyrells had ever dared tread. The realm was in turmoil, like a great pot near to boiling over, and the Tyrells were maneuvering to protect their interests just as every house worth its name did in these uncertain times. But in this moment, in this sanctuary of the faith, it was not King's Landing's tumultuous winds or her family's cunning that consumed her thoughts. It was Stannis Baratheon, the man to whom she had been promised. The vast interior of the September stretched overhead, magnificent in architecture, its storied walls displaying images of the Seven in all their glory. Though the rush of events around her was almost dizzying, Margaery still found a measure of calm here, within these towering columns of white marble. Golden light streamed through stained-glass windows depicting the Seven, pooling in broad swathes upon the ornate floor. She steadied herself. In a short while, she would become a bride for the second time. Memories of her first wedding, short-lived, overshadowed by tragedy and suspicion, by King Joffrey's cruelty, flickered through her mind. This time, she wondered if her wedding would be overshadowed by war, by the brooding storms that always seemed to follow Stannis Baratheon wherever he went. The High Septon himself would officiate. A small retinue of Tyrell bannermen had traveled all the way from Highgarden to witness the vow that might change the course of the war. They stood in the wings, clad in the green and gold livery of their house, proud yet wary, scanning the halls with all the vigilance that men in treacherous times must hold. Even so, Margaery felt the inquisitive gazes of the noble lords and ladies from other corners of the realm, a scattering of curious onlookers from House Redwyne, House Florent, even a few Lannisters who had staked their positions in King's Landing. Their reasons for attending were manifold. Some came out of genuine loyalty or curiosity, others came to gauge the might and advantage that might spring from such a union. But none was more vigilant than Margaery's own grandmother, the Queen of Thorns, perched in a pew near the dais, expression sharp, eyes narrowed with a cunning that belied her advanced years. Though outwardly, Olenna Tyrell kept her posture serene in public, Margaery had known enough of her grandmother's wrath to detect the subtle tension in that slight figure. Olenna's cane rested lightly against her knee, her knuckles only faintly white from gripping it so tightly. The Queen of Thorns had orchestrated alliances before, weaving cunning patterns from the chaotic tapestry of Westeros. But even she seemed uncertain of the paths that might open or close with this union. War made all alliances precarious, and Stannis Baratheon's claim to the throne had not yet been embraced by many. For it was Stannis, not Tommen or any boy king, who would stand before the High Septon and vow himself to Margaery. And so he stood near the altar, clad in dark armor beneath a more formal cloak of rich black cloth, embroidered with the stag in gold thread. He was still a rigid man, upright in posture, jaw set. The gauntness of his face revealed trials suffered on Dragonstone's windy battlements, the long nights and longer days planning each move in the war. His eyes were flinty, lacking warmth, yet they gleamed with purpose. On the ring finger of his left hand, he wore a band set with a single gleaming ruby. Some whispered it was infused with the power of the Red God, courtesy of Melisandre of Ass High, who lingered at the September's fringes, a scarlet shadow in the corner of Margaery's peripheral vision. Melisandre's presence was enough to set many tongues wagging, for the great September of Baelor was a symbol of the faith of the Seven, and the Red Woman's devotion to Lawlor was no secret. Yet Stannis had put forth an image of at least outward devotion to the faith of the Seven for this union. Some said it was a political maneuver, an attempt to rally more of Westeros's nobility to his banner, especially those who would not look kindly upon what they viewed as a foreign, fire-worshipping faith. Margaery did not know whether Stannis's new reverence was genuine or merely convenient, and she knew not how deeply the Red Woman's counsel reached into his ear. But then again, she told herself, such questions plagued nearly every alliance in these troubled days. Better to walk carefully and keep her own counsel, as she had learned to do. She moved forward with measured, elegant steps. She was not in a gown as ostentatious as the one she had worn at Joffrey's wedding. No heavy gold filigree, no plush purple velvet. Instead, she wore a gown of pale green, with subtle golden embroidery in the shape of vines and roses around the bodice. Her hair, braided in a crown around her head, was veiled only lightly by a net of golden lace. The Tyrell rose was pinned just above her heart in emerald threads. The effect was graceful, gentle, a reflection of the role she now chose to play. Let all who were watching see a bride determined to uphold her new husband's claim, but let them also see the tempered strength beneath her gracious smile. She halted before Stannis, inclining her head in a respectful greeting, murmuring the simple words of courtesy that one must speak. "My lord," she said. His gaze lingered on her only briefly, for though he replied with due courtesy, it seemed unnatural upon his lips. "My lady," he said, and though his tone was firm, Margaery sensed a flicker of unease or discomfort. She wondered if it was due to the splendor of the faith's seat, or the knowledge that this was a wedding he entered into as a necessity of war rather than a union of love. Perhaps it was both. The High Septon cleared his throat, calling for silence, and the congregation's murmurs subsided, the hush of anticipation descending like a soft shroud. He began to speak, voice echoing through the vast space, reciting the storied traditions of the faith of the Seven, blessings that had been bestowed on couples for centuries. Margaery listened with her eyes lowered demurely, her heart steady yet aware of the magnitude of the vow she was about to take. She heard the faint scraping of armor as Stannis shifted, the flicker of torchlight on metal. She tried to read his expression from the corner of her eye, but his countenance remained as still as stone. When the High Septon bade them repeat the ancient words, they did so, each word forging a link in the chain of obligations and loyalties that would bind House Tyrell and House Baratheon together. The realm was fracturing, with the scattered alliances forming and dissolving around rival claimants to the Iron Throne. Here, at least, stood two houses pledging themselves to a single cause, albeit a cause that many still questioned, for Stannis was known as the king in the Narrow Sea, the would-be usurper to the Lannister boys' throne, or an unyielding fanatic in the eyes of some. But Margaery possessed a natural gift for forging an appearance of unity, for wearing the face that others most wished to see. If she could extend some measure of charm over her new husband, then perhaps the realm might see a gentler side to Stannis' cause. With the final vow uttered, the High Septon raised his hands in blessing, proclaiming them man and wife in the eyes of the Seven. A ripple of applause spread through the September, restrained though it was. Stannis bowed his head solemnly, then turned to his bride. He bent a little stiffly, pressing a chaste kiss to her cheek. Margaery, smiling softly, accepted that small gesture with outward warmth, though she could sense the tension in his lips. She whispered a few words meant only for him, something about their union being the start of a stronger tomorrow, and she saw the briefest flicker in his eyes. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps a guarded kind of acceptance. With that, the ceremony was ended. Around them, the lords and ladies filtered out into the sunlight or into the outer corridors to speak among themselves. The High Septon offered a final benediction, and Margaery thanked him gracefully, inclining her head. Olenna Tyrell came forward, her wry, hawk-like gaze flicking over Stannis as if appraising a horse at market. "King Stannis," she said, a sharpness to her voice softened only by a veneer of polite ceremony. "You have my congratulations, and my granddaughter." If there was a subtle barb hidden in her words, Stannis was too impassive to show that he noticed. He acknowledged her with a nod, but Margaery could see the tension in the way his throat flexed. When at last the final well-wishers had taken their leave, Margaery found herself standing with Stannis at the foot of the steps, the sun's warmth settling over them. She glanced up to see the sky a clear, bright blue, as if the gods themselves had turned kindly eyes on the city, however briefly. Through the wide plaza, crowds of common folk parted to watch. Already word would be spreading. Stannis Baratheon and Margaery Tyrell, King Stannis and his new queen, stood united. The perspective of the small folk might matter as much as that of the great lords. Westeros was a swirl of rumor and fear, but a wedding might be a beacon of hope, or at least a curiosity worth discussing over ale at the local tavern. "My queen," Stannis said at length, gesturing her toward the horse-drawn litter that would bear them through the streets. She studied him for a moment, the planes of his face as immovable as a rock carved by storms. She was a queen now, though she knew such a title could vanish as easily as summer dew if they lost this contest of claims. Yet she had chosen this path, or had it chosen her? In truth, she recognized that her family saw an opportunity in supporting Stannis's claim, especially when whispers of illegitimacy clung to Joffrey and his siblings. For her part, she had resolved to serve her family's interests with the skill in persuasion and cunning that she possessed, for the roses of Highgarden had never been mere ornaments. If the alliance succeeded, they would stand near the seat of power, shaping it with the strength of their roots. She placed her hand lightly upon his proffered arm. "My king," she murmured in reply, and they advanced together. They dined that evening at the Red Keep, in a smaller hall less grand than the great hall with its iron throne. The Lannisters, still nominally in power with Tommen enthroned, were uncertain what to do about this ceremony, which had been performed with the High Septon's blessing. Indeed, the tension in the capital was palpable. No lavish feast had been prepared, no wide pavilions or unending courses of food. The wedding breakfast was a subdued affair, attended by a motley assembly of lords and ladies who either believed in Stannis's right or else wished to hedge their bets in some cunning way. Margaery ate lightly, sipping on watered wine, smiling at the occasional pleasantries from across the table, yet aware of the undercurrent of politics swirling about them. Stannis himself was never one for boisterous banquets or the luxuries of courtly entertainment. He sat with the rigid posture that defined him. Occasionally, he forced himself to speak politely, but more often than not, his silence spoke volumes. He did, however, afford Margaery a certain courtesy, listening intently whenever she addressed him, and offering measured responses. She tried to converse with him about events in the Narrow Sea, about the dispositions of his forces, about the storms swirling around Dragonstone. He seemed cautious, as if uncertain how much to reveal, but eventually he offered glimpses into the hardships and the convictions that had guided him since Robert's death. The presence of Melisandre was never far from Margaery's mind. The Red Priestess, clad in shimmering scarlet robes, moved through the corridors with an ethereal grace. At times, Margaery felt Melisandre's eyes upon her, those unsettling red orbs that seemed to look right through a person's flesh into their heart. Whether the woman disapproved of Margaery or was merely curious, Margaery could not say. Regardless, she knew that if she were to stand by Stannis' side, she would have to contend with the power and influence that Melisandre wielded. But Margaery was not without influence of her own. She had learned from the best, her grandmother, and even Cersei in some ways, and she knew how to navigate the labyrinth of courtly politics. By the following day, word of the marriage had spread throughout King's Landing. The small folk, always hungry for gossip, whispered about the new queen who had once been betrothed to King Renly, then wed to King Joffrey, and now was wed to King Stannis. Some found it amusing, others scandalous. Had she not also once named herself the bride of Renly Baratheon, who had declared himself king? And they remembered how his rainbow guard had surrounded her, how she had sought to charm them with sweet words and open smiles. Yet for all the talk, Margaery retained a veneer of innocence, of devotion to whichever cause she took up. Perhaps some small folk believed she was a blessing from the gods, who had tested her with adversity, or maybe they thought she was a cunning manipulator. Either way, she continued to wear the same poised smile, for she knew that a queen was as much a figure of rumor as of reality. From that day forward, Margaery took up the responsibilities of a queen in all but official name, for Tommen still sat the Iron Throne in the eyes of many. Yet in certain corridors of power, especially those that Stannis controlled or influenced, she began to serve as an ambassador of sorts, bridging the gap between her new husband's unyielding stance and the more pliable hearts of the commoners and minor lords. She made visits to the city's orphans and to the septas who did the gods' work, offering coin and kind words in equal measure. She knew how to be seen, how to let word carry her goodness far. The people needed hope, and if she could provide even a sliver of it, that could be turned to her advantage and to Stannis's. For all these activities, she would return to the solar that she shared with Stannis in the Red Keep, at least for the moment. He spent hours in council with the lords who had chosen to stand by him. Davos Seaworth, ever loyal and of humble birth. Some Tyrell bannermen who had sworn to serve Margaery's cause, and a scattering of knights and minor lords who had come to believe in Stannis's devout claim. Margaery would sometimes listen from the side, or be invited to sit at the table if the discussion required her input. She soon came to see the measure of the man. Unwavering, stern, shaped by duty and a sense of rigid justice. His conviction in his claim was absolute, and he held to it with the same iron that had always guided him. But the war was not won by conviction alone. Cersei Lannister, for all her flaws, was not one to yield the Iron Throne quietly on behalf of her young son. The scattered men loyal to the memory of Tywin Lannister kept a firm grip on many of the crown lands, while in the distance, the North reeled under its own troubles, and the Ironborn prowled the coasts, hungering for spoils. Margaery's presence did not solve these issues overnight, but it did soften Stannis's image, and she began to see letters arriving from Lords of the Reach and the Stormlands, curious if an arrangement with House Tyrell might lead them to reassess their allegiance. In the quiet moments that they had together, Stannis was distant but polite. Margaery noticed he lacked the easy courtesy or charming roguishness she had known in other men, such as Renly. She recognized that this was not a man who would swoon for her beauty or lavish her with compliments. Rather, he looked at her as if she were a co-commander, a partner of sorts in this great, desperate game for the throne. She adapted her approach accordingly, offering him forthright discussions of strategy, showing him that she possessed a keen mind behind her sweet smiles. One evening, by the candlelit desk in their shared solar, she ventured to speak with him about the deeper matters. "My king," she said softly, "I know you trust only a few, but if I am to be your queen, you must trust me, at least in some matters. The Lords of the Reach are proud. They will not bend easily to a man who has scorned them in the past, particularly to one who has so strongly embraced unusual beliefs." She chose her words carefully, aware of Melisandre's potential influence. "Allow me to speak with them, to show them what your reign might mean for Westeros." Stannis's lips pressed into a thin line. The candles flickered across his face, accentuating the hollows of his cheeks. "I have never scorned the Lords of the Reach," he said in that measured, gruff voice of his. "I only demanded they do their duty. Many sought the favor of Renly, because they found him more amiable. Perhaps they believed the throne was a prize to be bestowed upon the prettiest face or the most charming manner. They were wrong." He exhaled, the tension in his shoulders never quite leaving him. "Yet I am not blind to the fact that I need allies. Very well, speak to them if you wish, but do not promise them more than I can deliver. My justice is what it is." Margaery gave a small nod. "They will want to know what place the faith of the Seven holds under your rule. Many lords question your reliance on the Red Woman. Will you expect them to forsake the Seven if they join you?" She kept her voice carefully neutral, but the import of the question was obvious. The realm, by and large, worshipped the Seven, and Margaery, as a devout Tyrell, must represent their interests. She was well aware of how the presence of Melisandre could alienate potential allies. Stannis's mouth tightened. "I have seen things, Margaery. Things that have convinced me there is a power in R'hllor. But I recognize that not all share my experiences. If the lords will bend the knee and acknowledge my claim, if they will not rise up against my rightful reign, I will not tear their seps down. If that is the reassurance they need, you may tell them so." It was not precisely an enthusiastic endorsement of the faith, but it was something. Margaery could work with that, or at least attempt to shape it into a more palatable statement for the Lords of the Reach. "Thank you," she said softly, bowing her head, and she found that he was looking at her then, scrutinizing her in the glow of the candles. His gaze was that of a man who had never quite understood the intricacies of others' hearts, but who was beginning to see the value of such understanding. She managed a gentle smile, and after a moment, Stannis gave a curt nod, a sign that he would respect her counsel for the time being. Days turned into weeks, and the tides of war shifted almost daily. King Tommen's supporters sought to discredit Stannis' union by calling it nothing more than an opportunistic marriage to a woman with a penchant for changing kings like gowns. But the Tyrell name carried weight, and the more cunning among the nobility recognized that the union signaled a potential shift in alliances. Furthermore, the rumors of Joffrey's parentage, and by extension Tommen's, still lingered, fanning the flames of doubt. Cersei's hold upon King's Landing was eroding, and Stannis' presence in the city, once unthinkable, became an undeniable fact. With Margaery at his side, he sought to claim the Red Keep itself, to wrest it from the Lannisters. Tensions flared in the streets, though open fight. ING was limited. Neither side wanted to turn the capital into a smoking ruin, at least not yet. And overshadowing all of this was the question of what Tyrion Lannister might do, or Jaime, or the remnants of House Lannister's power. Every step forward for Stannis threatened to provoke a reaction, and the city was rife with rumors of infiltration, sabotage, and cunning manipulations. The Gold Cloaks were torn in their loyalties, some swearing to Tommen and some quietly shifting their allegiance if the wind seemed to blow in Stannis' favor. Margaery took pains to present a steady, benevolent face to the public, while Olenna Tyrell worked behind the scenes, forging or dissolving alliances as she saw fit. One afternoon, Margaery received a summons to meet a delegation of minor lords from the Reach who had come to King's Landing. They had heard of her marriage and sought to learn what it meant for their lands and their fealties. She arranged a small gathering in a newly refurbished solar near Maegor's Holdfast, a place bright with tall windows that let in the sunshine. She welcomed them graciously, offering refreshments of sweet wine and delicate pastries. Small courtesies, yes, but they were part of the art of persuasion she had honed over years. She wore a gown of soft green silk, embroidered with golden roses, her hair coiled in a modest style meant to evoke both the gentle warmth of the Reach and the dignified bearing of a queen. Among the visitors was Lord Meadows of Grassy Vale, an aging man who had once sworn fealty to Renly, then drifted uncertainly between different alliances after Renly's untimely death. With him came a cousin of House Hightower, Ser Brian, a younger knight who was rumored to hold the ear of Lord Leighton Hightower in Old Town. They seemed wary, their faces stern. Margaery gave them her warmest smile, inclining her head. "It warms my heart to see familiar faces from the Reach," she said. "I have missed the fields of Highgarden, the smell of roses and mint on the air. Please, be seated. Let us speak as friends." Lord Meadows cleared his throat. "Your Grace," he said, using the title tentatively, as if testing it. "We have heard troubling reports from the city. Word is that King Stannis grows more devout in his reliance on red flames and foreign gods." His eyes flicked around the chamber, and Margaery suspected he wondered if the Red Woman lurked behind the tapestries. "We come to you for reassurance. The Lords of the Reach are by and large devoted to the Seven. We do not wish to see them cast aside." Margaery poured each guest a cup of sweet wine, taking care to show no disquiet. "I understand your fears. Allow me to reassure you. While my husband has indeed witnessed the power behind Melisandre's faith, he has no intention of forcing that faith upon you. King Stannis is more concerned with ensuring justice and order in the realm. He is a man who upholds the law above all else." She sipped her own wine, letting her eyes rest on them gently. "If you uphold your oaths to him, he will uphold his duty to protect you and your people. That is the agreement he offers. As for the worship of the Seven, you will find no censure here." Ser Brian nodded thoughtfully. "Then you claim that the Red Woman's influence will not overshadow our own traditions?" Margaery shook her head. "She is an advisor, yes, but I too stand at King Stannis' side, and I am a daughter of Highgarden. I have not forsaken the Seven. I pray each morning in the September, and my husband does not forbid me." She allowed a note of earnestness to fill her voice. "Is that not a sign of tolerance?" The lords exchanged looks. Lord Meadows tapped the arm of his chair. "It may be. We also wonder about the stability of this claim. Tommen sits the throne, but he is but a boy. The Lannisters have long arms, and as I understand it, the city itself is still in turmoil." "Not as much as one might think," Margaery said gently. summoning the composure that had served her well in so many difficult conversations. Yes, we face challenges, but many good men and women see that King Stannis is the rightful heir, that Tommen and Joffrey were not true Baratheons. The faith itself sanctioned my marriage here, a statement of their recognition. There are those who question, but I believe the realm will soon see that we are the sure hand to guide Westeros. We only need the support of loyal lords such as yourselves. Ser Brian studied her carefully. And what of House Tyrell? He asked. We have heard that Lord Mace Tyrell is uncertain whether to support the Lannisters, as he had done through the previous marriages, or to shift fully behind you. Where does his loyalty lie? Margaery had anticipated the question. My father is a practical man, but he loves his children deeply. He will come to see that my union with King Stannis secures a brighter future for the Reach. Even now, my grandmother Olenna works to ensure that Highgarden remains safe, unthreatened by any Lannister reprisals. It is a delicate balance, but the Tyrells stand together. She fixed them with a confident look. When you write to your kin, you may tell them that your new queen will protect their interests. In time, I hope you shall see for yourselves the truth of these words. It was a dance of courtesy, half promises and reassurances, half unspoken warnings. But Margaery knew how to play her part well. At the end of the discussion, the lords left with cautious optimism. Their brows still furrowed, but their hostility somewhat soothed. Margaery was certain that word of her confidence, her diplomatic courtesy, would spread through the Reach, and that seeds would be planted. If House Tyrell officially declared for Stannis in open defiance of the Lannisters, it would be a pivotal moment indeed. But for now, she had done what she could, and she retreated to her own chambers to rest, feeling the weight of the realm upon her shoulders. Life in the Red Keep was uneasy. The corridors that had once been patrolled by red-cloaked knights loyal to the Lannisters now saw a mix of men wearing the crowned stag sigil or the golden rose. Tension sparked whenever rival guards crossed paths. Melisandre's presence was a reminder that Stannis's claim was tied to mysterious forces, and few were entirely comfortable with her. She would appear in the most unexpected places: a corridor near the kitchens, the top of a tower, a courtyard at dawn, and her serene, knowing smile unnerved many of the servants. Yet none dared speak against her openly, for she was the king's trusted confidant, and rumors of her power abounded. Margaery once encountered the priestess in the gallery overlooking the Great Hall. Margaery had gone up there to observe quietly as Stannis received petitions. She had grown used to seeing men come before him with grievances or requests for justice, only to leave with the knowledge that this king was not one to be swayed by tears or flattery. She was studying his methods, learning how best to guide him in more delicate negotiations. But Melisandre slipped into the gallery without a sound, her scarlet robes blending into the shadows, though she stood out vividly once Margaery noticed her. "Your Grace," Melisandre said in that low, resonant voice, "you watch your husband dispense justice." Margaery inclined her head, not letting the surprise show on her face. "I do. It is important to understand him, is it not?" Melisandre nodded, her red eyes flicking to the dais where Stannis sat, jaw set, hearing a dispute between two merchants over alleged theft. "He is Azor Ahai reborn," she said calmly, "a man of destiny, tempered by storms and battle. His is the song of fire, the chosen champion of the Lord of Light." Margaery knew better than to openly dispute that claim, so she merely smiled politely. "And you, my lady, have guided him in his path. That is known throughout the 7 kingdoms." The faintest curl of a smile touched Melisandre's lips. "I have helped him see the truth. But now you stand beside him as well, you who worship the 7. 2 faiths joined in one court." She paused, and the silence weighed upon Margaery like a subtle threat. "Are you content with this arrangement?" Margaery did not hesitate. "I am content that my husband has found faith in something that gives him strength. I do not wish to stand between him and that which he holds dear, nor do I wish him to stand between me and my prayers to the 7. Melisandre inclined her head slightly. "Wise words. Stannis Baratheon is a man shaped by destiny, but every man needs a woman at his side to soften the hardness of his convictions." Still be wary. The darkness in this world is strong. The great other waits always to extinguish the light. And sometimes, the most beautiful rose harbors the sharpest of thorns. Margaery felt a subtle chill at the priestess's words, but she maintained her composure. "Thank you for the counsel," she murmured. "I shall remember it." With that, Melisandre turned and walked away, her robes a swirl of crimson. Margaery exhaled softly, aware that whatever uneasy accord existed between them might shift in an instant should circumstances change. She knew she could not afford to antagonize the priestess of the Red God. Not yet, at least. For better or worse, they both had influence over Stannis, and to further the cause of the Baratheon claim, Margaery had to learn how to coexist with Melisandre. The weeks wore on, and Stannis's position in King's Landing solidified bit by bit, though it was far from secure. Conflict brewed outside the city walls, and alliances formed, broke, and reformed in the ephemeral swirl of politics. Margaery found herself sending letter after letter to her father, to her brother Loras, still bearing the scars of previous battles, to other relatives who might swing the tide of support. The more lords that pledged themselves to Stannis, the tighter his hold on the throne would become. Yet she knew that the Lannisters would not quietly vanish. Their gold and cunning had kept them afloat through many storms. One crisp morning, a raven arrived bearing a missive from Highgarden. Margaery took it in hand, reading the spidery script of her grandmother. The words were brief, but they spoke volumes. House Tyrell was preparing to declare itself firmly for Stannis, acknowledging him as the rightful king. Troops would be mustered. The decision had not been easy, for the Lannisters still commanded fear, but the union of Margaery and Stannis had shifted the calculus of risk. This was what Margaery had worked for, to assure her husband that her family would stand by him, and to assure her family that Stannis would not cast them aside. She went to Stannis with the letter, her posture dignified. He read it in silence, then set it down, his eyes flicking up to meet hers. "So it begins. The Tyrells will march under my banner." She nodded, allowing a modest smile. "It would seem so, my king." He drew in a breath, glancing out the window toward the shimmering waters of Blackwater Bay. "It is what I hoped for. Your presence has helped bring this about." Margaery was surprised by what sounded almost like gratitude. "I serve our cause, my lord, for the good of the realm." Stannis's eyes hardened again, though not unkindly. "The Lannisters will not take this lightly. Already, I hear their outriders test the roads west of the city. If the Tyrell armies come, we must be prepared for battle. They will attempt to crush us before we can consolidate our power." She reached out, placing a hand lightly on his arm, a gesture of solidarity that she had never dared to attempt with him before. "Then let us plan accordingly. The roses of Highgarden will join with the stags of Storm's End, and the realm shall see a new dawn." He regarded her hand on his arm, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once. "Yes, let them see." It was an afternoon of frantic strategy. Davos Seaworth, now Hand of the King, offered counsel in his honest, plain-spoken manner. Lord Tyrell's bannermen sent dispatches about troop movements. The gold cloaks of the city shifted their allegiance more openly toward Stannis, as it became clear that House Tyrell's wealth and manpower would bolster his reign. Cersei, overshadowed by the strengthening position of her rival, withdrew deeper into the Red Keep's labyrinthine corridors, her fury contained but seething. Tommen remained a puppet in her hands, still seated upon the Iron Throne in name, though more and more courtiers drifted to Stannis' side. The day soon came when the banners of House Tyrell appeared on the horizon. Thousands of men bearing the Golden Rose on a field of green, cavalry, infantry, even the famed archers of the Reach. They approached King's Landing with caution, unsure if they would be met as allies or enemies, for the city was far from wholly unified. But Margaery stood at the gates with her grandmother Olenna, having convinced Stannis of the importance of a regal welcome. The Tyrell host was greeted by Margaery's presence, her gown fluttering in the breeze, the Tyrell colors shining, the new queen standing tall. A roar went up among the Tyrell men, a cheer of relief and pride. Lord Mace Tyrell dismounted, bustling forward with his usual blend of self-importance and paternal affection for Margaery. "My daughter, my queen," he proclaimed grandly, sweeping her into a clumsy embrace. "I have brought the strength of Highgarden to secure your throne." She smiled, mindful that he needed to feel appreciated, though she knew a great portion of this was orchestrated by her grandmother. "Thank you, father. The realm shall remember your loyalty." He bowed with a flourish, and then turned to greet Stannis. There was a stiffness in his posture, for he and Stannis had never been the closest of allies. But necessity made allies of many unlikely pairs. Stannis descended the steps, accompanied by a small honor guard, black cloak trailing. In that moment, the tension between these two men was palpable. Stannis, austere and unyielding, Mace, bombastic and eager for recognition. But each understood that the other's support was crucial. "My lord," Stannis said, acknowledging him with a curt nod, "you have come at an opportune moment. The Lannisters still hold the western roads, and we must break their hold if King's Landing is to remain secure." Mace Tyrell puffed up his chest. "The men of the Reach shall follow my command and yours, your grace. We shall break the Lannisters as we once broke the Greyjoys." He cast a glance at Margaery. "Our rose stands in full bloom beside you, King Stannis." Margaery sighed inwardly but kept her countenance regal. This was how the game was played, and she knew that with Mace Tyrell's forces, Stannis's claim would suddenly feel far more formidable to the realm. Now came the hard part, actually winning the battles that would prove the claim unassailable. Preparations for war quickened. Scouts reported Lannister troop movements to the west, near the gold road leading toward Casterly Rock. Lines were drawn, alliances tested, and in the midst of this, Margaery strove to maintain a sense of calm and hope in the city, for she knew that if fear took root among the small folk, chaos would follow. The Tyrell Gardens, hastily grown in a new ward behind the Red Keep, were open to the public on certain feast days. Bread and fish were distributed at Margaery's command, an echo of the practice she had once followed under Joffrey's reign, but now infused with genuine attempts to keep the populace from starving. Where Stannis' stern hand might have driven men to resentment, Margaery's gentle approach offered a softer face for the throne. She began to receive more letters from lesser lords, inquiring about the possibility of transferring their fealty to Stannis without incurring ruin. Some were undoubtedly opportunists, but each represented a chink in the Lannisters' armor, and each was another sign that the tide was turning in Stannis' favor. Then, on a chilly morning, the horns sounded from the city's walls. The Lannisters were marching. Their banners were spotted to the west, and a host of thousands advanced on King's Landing with the intention of driving out Stannis' forces and re-establishing Tommen as the sole recognized king. The city braced for yet another siege, though this time, the gates were not locked in fear as they had been under Joffrey's rule. Instead, Stannis marched out to meet them, his newly expanded host at his back. The men of the Stormlands, clad in their stag-emblazoned armor, marched alongside columns of Tyrell men, their banners flapping in the wind. Margaery stood atop the city walls with her grandmother, watching the army's muster. War was an ugly thing, and her heart panged with the knowledge that thousands might die this day. But this was the reality of the Game of Thrones, blood paid for power. She could only hope that her presence would prevent unnecessary cruelty, and that a swift resolution could be reached. The banners spread out across the fields before the city, a kaleidoscope of color and steel. Stannis, mounted on a dark charger, led his vanguard with grim determination. Davos rode beside him, and to Stannis' other side, unexpectedly, was Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, recently arrived from Highgarden. Loras wore shining armor adorned with a golden rose, and even from the city walls, Margaery thought she could see the tension in his posture. He would fight for her, for their family, even though once he had pledged loyalty to Renly. The world turned, alliances shifted, and here they stood. The Lannister host approached, led by the Scarlet and Gold Lions. Margaery recognized the sigil from countless feasts and tournaments in better days. Now it came as a threat, a challenge, the lethal will of the West. She heard the drums beating across the field, the horns blaring. Armies do not meet in neat, arranged lines for long, especially when so many factors swirl around the battlefield. Fear, pride, greed, the thirst for glory. As the Lannister hosts drew closer, their ranks spread in disciplined columns, shining plate armor catching the pale daylight. From the city walls, Margaery could see the high-crested helmets of the knights, the banners fluttering above them, the drums rattling like distant thunder. She kept her posture straight, the wind tugging at the loose tendrils of her hair, and forced herself not to flinch at every horn blast. Down below, Stannis and the Tyrell commanders organized their own formation. Armor clanged, horses snorted. Men shouted orders that carried across the open fields in dissonant echoes. Already, streams of refugees, peasants, tradesmen, frightened families, trickled toward the gates, but Margaery had instructed the guards to let them in, to keep them safe behind walls that would, God's willing, remain unbreached. Although Margaery was no stranger to war, she had lived through battles, through sieges, even if often protected by others. Each new conflict wore upon her heart. The clash between Baratheon and Lannister forces outside the city only underscored the fragility of power in Westeros. She couldn't deny the dark thrill of seeing the Lannister banners challenged, after the cruelty she had endured under Joffrey's reign, and the endless manipulations she had witnessed from Cersei. Still, many of those who marched beneath those lion sigils were ordinary men, caught in the swirl of noble ambitions. Blood would water the fields before day's end, and no matter which side claimed victory, the cost would be high. Craning her neck, she tried to spot her brother Loras among the milling ranks on the eastern flank, for she knew he was there, shining in gilded armor, the Tyrell rose glinting above his breastplate. She imagined him with helm under one arm, rein in the other hand, scanning the horizon for the first sign of engagement. If only she could speak with him one more time before the armies clashed. But it was too late for that. The lines were set. Swords would soon be drawn. Prayers to the Seven tumbled through her mind, and she murmured them under her breath, though she knew that prayers alone could not shield the men who fought in her family's name. Stannis, too, was in the thick of preparation, though his mind was of a different mold. He believed victory must be won through discipline and justice, not through sentiment or hope. More than once, Margaery had seen him in the yard at dawn, steel in hand, as he practiced his sword forms with uncanny precision. He carried that same grim focus now into this confrontation. He had no illusions that the Lannisters could be cowed by anything less than open battle or a decisive blow to their power. And so, he had arrayed his men to strike first, trusting that the Tyrell reinforcements would hold the line against any Lannister feint or encirclement. Below, the horns gave a mournful note, and the host of Baratheon and Tyrell soldiers surged forward. Thousands of feet churned the ground into clods. Thousands of voices shouted war cries or words of command. The cavalry thundered out, banners whipping, lances lowered. One heartbeat, 2, 3, and then it happened. The lines met in a furious collision of metal and flesh. Even from the walls, Margaery heard the awful roar of it, an impact that made her blood run cold. The flash of steel on steel carried across the field. Horses screamed as pikes found their mark. Men toppled in the mud, some rising to fight on, some never rising again. The Lannisters held firm at first, their discipline a testament to generations of wealth and martial tradition. On their own flanks, they unleashed flights of arrows that arced black against the sky before plummeting into the Tyrell ranks. More horns bellowed, calling for charges, regroupings, retreats. Margaery found her hands clenched around the cold stone merlin, knuckles whitening. She wanted to look away, but her gaze remained locked on the swirling chaos. She wondered if the rest of the city's inhabitants watched in horror from their own vantage points or hid within their hovels, praying for a swift end. Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns, stood nearby, her posture as erect as her age permitted, eyes as sharp as ever. She said nothing, only pursed her lips at times, tapping her cane once or twice against the parapet in a sign of impatience. Every so often, she would lean forward, as if trying to catch a glimpse of a particular banner or group of knights. Margaery guessed she, too, was searching for Loras, or even for Mace, who would be directing troops further back, commanding from relative safety. "It's begun," Olenna finally said in a dry voice, half lost beneath the clash of arms. Margaery only nodded, feeling her throat constrict. Hours seemed to bleed together as the fighting raged on. Commanders shouted themselves hoarse, rallying their men. Wave after wave of fresh Tyrell pikemen joined the fray when the initial lines threatened to buckle. The Lannisters countered with cavalry sweeps that drove into the Baratheon ranks, forcing them to form a bristling wall of spears. Now and then, Margaery glimpsed shining black armor that could only belong to Stannis. He was deep in the melee, fighting with that same relentless intensity she had glimpsed when he'd practiced at dawn, blade rising and falling in an unerring cadence. Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight, stayed close, rallying men around the king to ensure he wasn't surrounded. Olenna made a disapproving cluck. Stannis is too far forward. The king ought to be more protected. Margaery pressed her lips together. He believes it important to show the men his own courage. Humph, Olenna muttered, but said nothing further. Perhaps she realized the futility of complaining about a man like Stannis, who considered half measures a kind of cowardice. Eventually, it became clear that the Tyrell lines were slowly gaining ground. The battered Lannister forces began to waver, their center fraying as the flanks struggled to support it. The impetus of thousands of Rose Knights, combined with the unyielding pike formations, was wearing them down. The day's heat, too, took a toll, shimmering off the field in ripples of dusty sun. Men in heavy plate and mail fought as sweat poured into their eyes, stinging them, blurring their vision. War horns signaled reorganizations, but soon the Lannister horns grew more frantic, calling for partial retreats, repositioning battered regiments in desperate attempts to hold the line. Yet the Tyrell host pressed relentlessly onward. Great plumes of dust and smoke drifted over the battlefield, obscuring details but revealing enough to indicate that the Lannister line was collapsing in places. When at last the line gave way, it happened in a cascade, as though the backbone of the army had snapped. Margaery saw pockets of Lannister soldiers trying to flee, only to be overtaken by Stannis' cavalry, or pinned down by disciplined Baratheon spears. Some knights flung off their lion-crested helmets and dropped to their knees, pleading for quarter. Others fought to the death, unwilling to endure the shame of defeat. By the time the sun sank to the west, the battlefield was a nightmarish sprawl of bodies and broken weaponry. Crows circled overhead, drawn by the gruesome promise of carrion. Shredded banners drooped from splintered poles. The Lannister host, or what remained of it, fled beyond the horizon, while Stannis' outriders harried their rear. The watchers on the city walls murmured among themselves, uncertain whether to grieve or rejoice. At length, the gates were opened again, and Margaery saw riders bearing the crowned stag and the golden rose returning under the archway. A ragged cheer went up from those gathered to witness the victory. They were safe, at least for now. Margaery hurried down from the walls, ignoring her own exhaustion. The adrenaline of battle had kept her heart pounding. Now she had to see what had become of the men she loved, her husband, her brother, her father. The courtyard below was a chaotic swirl of returning knights, many dismounting with pained grunts or collapsing from wounds. Grooms rushed forward to lead away exhausted horses, and the men of the city watch tried to direct the flow of traffic. Servants carried stretchers for the gravely injured, while the faint moans and cries of pain underscored that no victory in Westeros came without cost. Her gown gathered dust and grime as she navigated the courtyard, but she was heedless of it. She caught sight of Loras first. He was spattered with blood, though most of it did not appear to be his. A shallow cut marred his cheek, and his tabard, embroidered with the Tyrell rose, was torn. Yet he was alive, and the relief that flooded Margaery was almost enough to make her knees go weak. She rushed to him, her voice hoarse with worry. "Loras!" He turned, wincing at the movement, and tried to put on a brave smile. "Sister!" Before he could utter more words, Margaery reached him, and for a moment she forgot decorum, throwing her arms around him as best she could in his battered armor. He hugged her back, eyes glimmering with fatigue. "We did it," he whispered. "Davos says the Lannisters have fled, or at least the bulk of them. We hold the field." She pulled back, hands still gripping his shoulders. "I was so worried. The fighting looked fierce." He nodded, glancing at the litter of wounded men around them. "It was. Stannis led us well, though." He never faltered, not even when the Lannisters tried to flank our center. Loras frowned. "He's still out there, finishing the pursuit, I believe." Margaery set her jaw. "I hope he doesn't throw himself into needless danger." Their conversation was interrupted by a cry of "Make way for the king," and the throng in the courtyard parted. Stannis rode in on a horse lathered in sweat, his black armor gouged and scraped in several places. He swung down stiffly, letting a nearby soldier hold the reins. The tension in his face spoke of a man who had spent every ounce of his will and strength on the day's fight. Yet he was alive, unbroken, and victory shone in his eyes, subdued but present. Margaery excused herself from Loras's side and made her way toward her husband. A hush fell around them as warriors, servants, and onlookers gave the king space. "You're not wounded?" she asked quietly, scanning him for blood. "Only a few bruises," he replied in that rough, direct tone. "The seven were with me, or perhaps the Lord of Light." He paused, as though uneasy, referencing both faiths in the same breath. "Either way, we held true. The Lannisters have retreated. We have the city again." His dryness might have been humor or relief. Margaery allowed herself a small smile. "Thank the gods." She studied his face, noticing a streak of blood near his temple. "You should see the maesters. Even if it's a scratch, best to clean it before it festers." He grunted in acknowledgement. "Very well." Then, seeming to remember his status as king before the eyes of others, he straightened his shoulders and lifted his voice enough to carry. "We have won a great victory today. The Lannisters will think twice before challenging the rightful crown of Westeros." A smattering of ragged cheers rose in the courtyard. Exhausted men gave shouts of "King Stannis," or pounded their breastplates in salute. Margaery let the moment stretch out, for they all needed some sense of triumph, battered though they were. Finally, when it became clear that Stannis was on the verge of going to his war council rather than to the maesters, she touched his arm gently. "Come, let the maesters tend you, and let someone wash away the dust. War councils can wait an hour, can they not?" His lips thinned, but he nodded. "An hour. After that, I must speak with the lords." She led him within, feeling the eyes of the soldiers follow them. Perhaps they wondered at the sight. Stannis Baratheon, notoriously rigid, allowing this new queen of his to guide him so gently. Some might grumble that he was under the sway of a Tyrell, but Margaery knew better. She had simply learned how to nudge Stannis in small ways, how to persuade him toward caution when needed, or mercy if the situation allowed. Inside, the Red Keep bustled with frantic activity, as the wounded were carried to the Maester's Tower or the Great Hall for temporary triage. Already, the smell of blood and burned flesh seeped through the corridors, and the echo of moans drifted between the stone walls. A hush of horror clung to the castle. Margaery guided Stannis to a smaller antechamber used for private audiences, where a maester and 2 young novices had set up a station to tend minor injuries. More grievous wounds had to wait, for the maesters were overwhelmed. "There," Margaery said, gesturing. Stannis removed his gauntlets and allowed the maester to examine the cut on his head. It was indeed shallow, but it bled enough to matter. While the maester cleaned and dressed it, Margaery stepped back, watching carefully to ensure nothing was missed. When the maester finished, he bowed. "Your Grace, you should rest. We have suitable tonics to help you sleep or quell any pain." Stannis shook his head. "Rest can come later. There is still much to do." The maester nodded, but Margaery could see the concern in his eyes. Once he withdrew, she moved closer. "My lord, if you drive yourself to collapse, you will serve no one. At least sit, have a meal, gather your thoughts." He gave her a long look. "There is truth in what you say. Very well. Come." They walked together toward the king's private solar, a chamber that had once belonged to the Targaryens, then the Targaryen-appointed masters-at-arms, then the Baratheons, then back to the Targaryens in Robert's rebellion, and so forth, 1,000 shifts of power etched into these stones. Torches flickered along the corridor, illuminating worn tapestries that still bore the crowned stag or the more recent editions of Tyrell roses. Outside, the sky grew darker, the final embers of daylight fading into twilight. Servants hurried to and fro, carrying bandages, water, or leftover food from the larders. The castle was alive with the aftermath of battle. Stannis led Margaery inside. At his nod, a pair of guards closed the doors, granting them privacy. The chamber was modest for a king. Stannis never insisted on lavish surroundings, but it contained a sturdy oaken table, a few chairs, and a large hearth. Light from the hearth danced over the walls, casting an orange glow upon Stannis's tired face. He removed his cloak, letting it fall across the back of a chair. He wore only a padded gambeson under his partially stripped armor now, having removed the most cumbersome pieces. "I'll have food brought," Margaery said. "Bread, broth, something warm for you." She moved to the small bell pull, intending to summon a servant, but Stannis's hand reached out, gently catching her wrist. "Wait," he said quietly. "Sit with me first." She turned to face him, surprised by his request. Though they were married, Stannis was not a man given to small courtesies or open affections. For him to ask that she sit was unusual, so she nodded, letting the bell pull go. They sank into chairs near the hearth, the crackle of the flames filling the hush. She studied the lines of his face. Harsh, uncompromising, but streaked with weariness. Specks of dried blood flecked the collar of his gambeson. "You fought bravely today," she ventured. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I fought as I must. Bravery is often just necessity." His gaze flicked over her, as though evaluating her next words. She folded her hands in her lap. "Will the Lannisters regroup, do you think? Or have we broken their spine?" Stannis ran a hand across his brow. "The West has resources to spare, and the Rock is formidable. It's too early to say we've broken them entirely, but we've gained precious ground. If the Lannisters can't sweep us out of King's Landing, that emboldens other lords to consider me the rightful king. Some who have wavered may now be more inclined to join." Margaery nodded. This was in line with what she had been hoping for. A demonstration of Baratheon Tyrell's strength to tip the scales of uncertain houses. "Then we should capitalize on this, send out riders bearing the news of victory, urging lords to bend the knee. Offer them pardons or favorable terms if they switch sides soon." His mouth twisted, as though he tasted something bitter. "You would have me coax them with pardons. Should we not?" Margaery leaned forward slightly. "Some of these men have never truly believed Tommen was the rightful heir. They followed him out of fear or convenience, or the influence of gold. If they see a chance to swear loyalty to you, they might do so without more bloodshed. War is costly." He sighed. "War is beyond costly, but I do not relish letting traitors slip free unpunished. You have always prized justice, my king, and justice does not mean punishing those who submit and pledge true loyalty. The realm needs peace, not endless retribution." She softened her tone. "Surely mercy can be a form of justice as well." He regarded her for a moment, eyes narrowed. Then he gave a curt nod. "Very well. Davos has always spoken of the power of second chances. I will consider it." The corners of her mouth curved in a small smile. She could sense how difficult it was for Stannis to compromise in any measure. Yet he was making an effort to listen to her counsel. She rose, crossing the room to the bell pull, and tugged it. Within moments, a young page arrived, wide-eyed and breathless. Margaery instructed him to bring a simple meal, bread, cheese, ale, and warm broth if the kitchens had any. The page bowed and hurried off. When they were alone again, Stannis spoke in a low voice. "You have shown skill in shaping hearts, Margaery. I see it in how you speak to the lords, how you move among the small folk. I have never possessed that gift." She folded her arms gently. You have other gifts, my lord, ones the realm needs. Our strengths are different but complementary. He stared into the flames. The Red Woman says I am the warrior of the Lord of Light, chosen for a great purpose. I once thought that might be enough, that right would conquer by sheer force of will. But now I see that men need more. They need hope. They need a reason to believe in the king they follow. Perhaps they need you as well. It was as close to a confession of need as Margaery had heard from Stannis. She felt a twinge of sympathy for this grim man who carried the weight of a crown no one had ever expected him to wear. We both do what we must, she said softly. And one day, if we are victorious, the realm will see the good you can do. He exhaled, shaking his head as if brushing away sentiment. The page returned, bearing a tray laden with a steaming bowl of broth, a small loaf of bread, and a wedge of cheese. Margaery dismissed him with a nod, then set the tray on the table between them. Stannis reached out to break off a piece of bread, tearing at it absently before dunking it into the broth. She could tell the full measure of his exhaustion by the way his shoulders sagged once he allowed himself a moment to breathe. Eat, rest a little, she urged again. I'll speak with grandmother and father, see what condition their men are in. Then we'll plan our next moves. He acknowledged her with a grunt. Yes, you do that. I won't be idle for long. Margaery watched him for a moment, then took her leave, gliding out of the solar with careful steps. Outside, 2 guards stiffened as she passed, bowing their heads. She offered them a polite smile, though her thoughts were already turning to the wounded men, to the shape of the city's morale, and to how best she could ease the suffering that always followed battle. She made for the Maester's tower first, where she knew the worst of the wounded were being gathered. The corridors near the tower stank of blood and burned flesh. Archmaester Gorman, called in from Old Town by House Tyrell's influence, had taken charge. He stood in the midst of a corridor lit by flickering sconces, issuing sharp orders to novices and serving girls. Margaery approached, and he dipped his head respectfully. Your Grace, he said, lifting a hand slick with some pungent salve. I wish I could greet you under more pleasant circumstances. Margaery inclined her head. Thank you for your efforts, Archmaester. Is there anything I can do? More supplies, more help from the city's septas. He gestured around, his silver chain rattling. We need whatever we can get. Clean linens, fresh water, poppy milk for the wounded. Some men suffer injuries that will kill them by dawn if we can't stanch the bleeding. Others might survive if we can keep the wounds clean and treat fevers. He paused, glancing at her with a mixture of respect and urgency. Any additional help is welcome. Margaery promised him exactly that. She knew the city stores might be limited, but she would scour every corner for linens, arrange for well water to be drawn in vast quantities, and gather the city's septas and silent sisters who were skilled in tending the injured. It was the least she could do for the men who had shed blood in the name of Baratheon and Tyrell alike. Also, she added, lowering her voice, do what you can for the Lannister men among the wounded. If they are in our custody, we owe them humane treatment. The Archim. Esther's brows rose slightly, but he nodded. As you command, Your Grace. She left him to his work. The sour tang of wounds lingered in her nose as she made her way to the Great Hall, which had been partially converted into a triage area for men whose injuries were less severe. Servants hurried about, lighting additional torches. A few haggard-looking knights, arms slung in makeshift bandages, leaned against the walls, waiting their turn. Margaery stepped among them, offering words of comfort, praising their bravery, assuring them the king was grateful for their service. She knew that hearing such things from the queen could lift spirits, even if it did little to ease physical pain. She spotted Loras again, this time removing his armor piece by piece with the help of a squire. His face was set in a grimace as he tried to maneuver his injured shoulder. Margaery hurried to him. Let me help, she said gently, motioning the squire aside. With careful hands, she eased the dented breastplate over Loras's head. He hissed through clenched teeth, eyes watering. Beneath, his arming doublet was soaked in sweat. It's just a bruise, he insisted, though Margaery suspected something worse. I had worse at the Blackwater. She offered a small, knowing smile. Worse or not, you should let the maesters check. And you should rest. He tried to scowl. Rest is for men who have nothing left to do. We're still at war, aren't we? Yes, we are. And that's why we need you whole. Now come. Let's find a place for you to sit. She guided him to one of the benches along the hall's perimeter. He sank down with a groan, pressing a hand to his shoulder. Margaery gestured to a passing novice, who hurried off to fetch a poultice or bandages. For a moment, sister and brother breathed in silence amid the moans of the injured and the shuffle of feet. After a time, Loras spoke, his voice subdued. You did well, Marg. Holding the city together in these days, forging the alliance with Stannis. It's all so different from when you were Joffrey's bride. She swallowed, remembering all too vividly those days of fear and uncertainty. It is, and I thank the gods for that difference. At least Stannis. He may be stern, but he is no monster. Loras nodded, eyes drifting shut for a moment. You truly think we can make something good out of this war? That House Tyrell will stand tall when it's done. Margaery gently touched his arm, mindful of his pain. I do. We must, Loras. The realm has known nothing but bloodshed. Perhaps, with Stannis on the throne and the Tyrells at his side, we can bring an end to this madness. He opened his eyes, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Gods bless you, sister, for believing it. We'll fight for that hope. The novice returned, a jar of herbal salve in hand. Margaery stayed with Loras, helping apply the salve to his bruised shoulder. He hissed at the sting but soon relaxed under the coolness of the ointment. She promised him she'd have fresh bandages and some poppy milk brought if the pain became unbearable. Then, leaving him in the novice's care, she rose to continue her rounds. Hour by hour, the night wore on. Margaery oversaw the distribution of water and linen, made sure that even the humblest foot soldiers had a place to rest. She navigated the halls with a serenity that belied her own exhaustion. Each time a soldier recognized her and tried to bow, she told them to save their strength. By the time the sky grew black and the last purple traces of sunset vanished, she had seen enough suffering to haunt her dreams. Finally, with all immediate tasks addressed, she returned to the royal apartments. A few guards stood at attention. They opened the doors for her with murmured respect. Inside, she found the hearth burned lower, casting flickering shadows. Stannis was awake, seated at the table, studying a roll of parchment by candlelight. He glanced up as she approached. You've been busy, he said. I've heard from the men that you personally tended to them, saw to their needs. She clasped her hands in front of her. It's the duty of a queen, is it not? Or at least it should be. He set the parchment down. There are some queens who would not bother. You do. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Margaery took a step forward. Are you still in pain? He exhaled. Some stiffness, nothing more. The battle was a harsh one, but not my first, and likely not my last. He tapped the parchment. I've word of other Lannister movements. They might rally near Harrenhal with some loyal bannermen, or possibly retreat to the west to bolster their defenses around Casterly Rock. Nothing is certain yet. Margaery lowered herself into the chair opposite him. Then we must send out scouts, gather intelligence. We can't let them regroup and blindside us. His jaw tensed. Agreed. I'll send Davos to handle negotiations with any lords who might see reason in this victory. We'll keep the Tyrell forces prepared for another march if necessary. She nodded, reaching for the pitcher of water on the table, which was nearly empty. She poured what remained into a cup, sipped, and felt the dryness of her throat recede. How will we keep the city calm? The small folk have seen enough upheaval to last a lifetime. He frowned. Enforce order. The gold cloaks will remain under my command. Those who still waver in loyalty must be replaced. Margaery knew that heavy-handed tactics could breed resentment, but she also understood the need for stability. I'll do my part to reassure them, she said. Food distribution, small acts of charity. It can ease tensions. Stannis gave a single nod, as though the idea had merit. See to it, then. A heavy silence settled, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Margaery looked at Stannis, remembering the way he had fought so fiercely, how even now weariness lined his face, yet a certain determination burned in his eyes. She felt an odd pang of admiration. This was not love in the storybook sense, but it was respect, a sense of shared purpose that bound them. Softly, she asked, "Do you regret marrying me?" He blinked, seeming taken aback by the question. "Why would I?" She shrugged one shoulder, gaze drifting toward the flames. "We had to marry in haste for the claim, for the alliance. I know it wasn't out of affection. Sometimes I wonder if you resent this union." He studied her, the firelight flickering over his stern features. At length he answered, "Resent? No. I needed the Tyrells, and in truth the Tyrells needed me even if they did not know it at first. We serve each other's cause. You have proven more capable than I expected, both in matters of state and in matters of the heart." A faint, almost awkward pause. "I'm not adept at kindness. I know that, but I do not regret having you at my side." Margaery felt a tension she hadn't realized she carried melt away, replaced by a gentle warmth. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I will continue to do my duty, not just for my family, but for our shared realm." He inclined his head, and for a fleeting moment, she thought he might reach for her hand or speak a word of tenderness. But the moment passed, lost in the swirl of duty that surrounded them both. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "You should sleep, my lord," she said. "I shall as well. Tomorrow, I suspect, will bring its own trials." He sighed, glancing at a stack of fresh parchments. "Yes, though these letters won't write themselves. An hour of rest is better than none," she insisted gently. Stannis gave her a wry look. "Again you speak truth. Very well. I will retire soon." Margaery let a small smile curve her lips. "Good night, then." She inclined her head and retreated to her own adjoining chamber, leaving him with the warmth of the fire and the weight of correspondence. As she closed the door behind her, she felt the fatigue of the day settle upon her. Her maids awaited, prepared to help her disrobe, but she waved them off, wanting only a moment's solitude. She lit a single candle near the small altar to the 7 she had arranged in her chamber. Before it, she whispered a prayer, to the maiden for hope, to the warrior for courage, to the mother for compassion, to the father for justice. Then she slipped out of her gown, let the maids unfasten her braids, and collapsed onto the bed. Sleep took her swiftly, haunted by the memory of the battlefield and the cries of the dying. When dawn broke, she awoke with the weight of her responsibilities pressing anew. She dressed in a modest yet elegant gown of dove-gray silk embroidered with golden roses at the sleeves, braided her hair back, and prepared to face whatever the day might bring. The corridors outside were quieter now, for many of the wounded either slept or had been moved to more permanent quarters for care. The dead, however, still had to be accounted for. Already, the Silent Sisters would be tending to the bodies, giving them their final rites. Margaery resolved to ensure they were shown respect, regardless of what sigil they had worn in life. She met Olenna Tyrell in a lesser courtyard, where the elder lady perched on a stool, eating a handful of fresh berries a servant had brought. She eyed Margaery's approach with sharp curiosity. "Up so early, my sweetling? You should rest more. The war won't end on your account." Margaery bent to kiss her grandmother's cheek. "I slept enough to regain my wits. How fair are men?" Olenna waved her cane dismissively. "Tired and bloodied, but not broken. Your father is strutting around claiming we've dealt the Lannisters a mortal blow. I doubt it's quite so fatal, but we'll take what we can get. And Loras is healing, I trust." "Yes, he's bruised, but he'll be fine." Margaery glanced around at the walls, noticing a new sense of calm. This may be the first morning in a long while that doesn't seem overshadowed by looming disaster. Olenna let out a dry chuckle. "Don't get too comfortable. Even if the Lannisters are licking their wounds, we've plenty of trouble brewing elsewhere. The Iron Islands, Dorne, the North. The realm is a jigsaw puzzle. and half the pieces are missing or set aflame. Margaery couldn't disagree. Still, one victory is better than none. We'll need to consolidate. Grandmother, can you help me with the tasks of provisioning the city? Archmaester Gorman said the wounded need more linens and supplies. Olenna gave a brisk nod. Of course, I'll coordinate with the stewards and see what we can gather from the local guilds. The city is starved for coin, but the Tyrell coffers aren't empty. It's all about making sure the gold is spent where it matters, rather than on fool's errands. Margaery pressed her grandmother's hand lightly in thanks. I appreciate it. Olenna eyed her, faint concern flickering in those piercing eyes. You seem tired, dear. Don't let that Baratheon scowl rub off on you. You're too pretty for such frowns. Margaery summoned a small smile. I'll keep that in mind. With that, they parted ways, each attending to their respective duties. Margaery spent the better part of the morning meeting with various household servants, the city's bailiffs, and the septas who had come to offer aid. She arranged for those capable of sewing or weaving to produce fresh bandages at speed, offered payment drawn from Tyrell resources to bolster the city's meager supplies, and coordinated a systematic approach for distributing bread and fish to the poor. The city's gates, though not sealed, were under heavy guard, preventing an influx of vagrants or bandits in the aftermath of the battle. Still, Margaery hoped to extend a hand to the genuinely needy. Around midday, she received word that Stannis had called a war council in the Great Hall. She hurried there, her skirts rustling over the polished stone floors. Sunlight poured in through the high windows, illuminating the once imposing throne room. At the far end, the Iron Throne loomed, a jagged silhouette of melted swords. Below it, a long table had been set up. A number of figures stood gathered around. Stannis at the head, Davos Seaworth beside him, Mace Tyrell in green and gold finery, a few loyal bannermen in their respective house colors, and even Melisandre, a flash of crimson among the neutral tones of armor and cloak. As Margaery approached, the conversation paused. Stannis inclined his head in acknowledgement of her presence. She stepped into the circle, meeting the gazes of those present. Davos offered a polite nod, while Mace Tyrell gave a broad, somewhat pompous grin. We were just discussing our next move, Stannis said. The Lannisters have retreated, but we need to know whether they plan to regroup or mount a more subtle threat within the city. Davos cleared his throat. Riders have gone out to scout. We should hear back soon. Meanwhile, the city remains ours, and we must fortify it. Mace puffed out his chest. And my men stand ready to march if needed, Your Grace. The Tyrell host can hold King's Landing against another assault. Stannis gave him a measured look. We appreciate House Tyrell's commitment, but we also must ensure the city itself is pacified. The small folk are hungry, uneasy. There's rumor of infiltration by Lannister agents, spies who might attempt sabotage. Margaery spoke softly. We can quell the small folk's fear by continuing the distribution of food, by showing them that this new rule is not a reign of terror. If the people support the Baratheon claim, then any saboteurs will find few friends. Stannis nodded curtly. Agreed. Davos, work with the gold cloaks to increase patrols. Keep an eye out for suspicious activity. Margaery, continue your efforts to bring relief to the small folk. They must see that we stand for justice and stability. Melisandre's voice slid into the conversation, smooth as silk. And do not forget the power of the red flame. The great Other's agents may walk among us, sowing shadows. It is best to keep our vigilance not only in this realm, but against all that lurks beyond mortal sight. Margaery forced herself not to stiffen. She inclined her head politely, offering no direct challenge to the priestess. Still, her voice remained calm. We shall be vigilant, my lady. There are many forms of darkness, and they thrive on fear. Melisandre's red lips curved into a smile that hinted at hidden knowledge, but she said nothing more, letting Stannis continue. He laid out the immediate plan, to strengthen the city's defenses, to send envoys to lords in the Crownlands and the Reach who might be undecided, and to keep a watchful eye on word from the west. The tension in the hall was palpable. Everyone present understood that while they had won a crucial battle, the war was still uncertain. The Lannisters might not be as mighty as before, but they were far from powerless. As the council concluded, Margaery found herself lingering. She could sense that Mace Tyrell wanted a private word with Stannis, perhaps to angle for more recognition or to secure additional honors for the Tyrell name. She slipped away, trusting in her father's ability to gloat about victory without her immediate presence. Instead, she made her way to a side passage that led out of the hall. She was halfway down it when she heard light footsteps behind her. Glancing back, she saw Melisandre. The priestess's scarlet gown trailed behind her like living embers, her expression as inscrutable as ever. She inclined her head. "Your Grace," she said softly. Margaery slowed her pace. "Lady Melisandre." The corridor was dim, lit only by a few torches. The flickering light made the shadows on Melisandre's face dance. For a moment, Margaery thought she saw a flicker of real concern in the red woman's eyes, but it vanished almost immediately. "You have grown closer to the king," Melisandre observed, her tone neutral. "He listens to your counsel." Margaery met that crimson gaze steadily. "I am his wife and queen. It is only natural that I offer him counsel." A faint smile touched the corners of Melisandre's lips. "Of course, yet not all wives hold true influence, especially with a man like Stannis. He is no easy heart to sway." Margaery considered her words carefully. "He is a man of duty and conviction. If I can aid him, I will." Melisandre's gaze slipped toward the far end of the corridor, as though seeing something invisible to Margaery. "So long as you do not stand in the way of his destiny. Remember, Queen of Roses, that Stannis has a greater purpose than merely holding a throne. He fights a war far older and darker than the squabbles of the noble houses." Margaery inclined her head. "I've heard your tales of shadows and prophecy, my lady. I do not claim to fully understand them, but I have no wish to hinder him. We both want Stannis to succeed." Melisandre pressed her lips together. "Then we have an accord. For now." There was a subtle note of warning in her voice, but Margaery refused to bristle. She had grown adept at skirting around such veiled threats. Instead, she dipped her head in polite farewell and continued on her way, leaving Melisandre behind in the half-lit corridor. She could feel the priestess's stare linger until she turned a corner, and only then did she let out a slight breath. Melisandre's presence unsettled her, not only because of her cryptic references to ancient powers, but because Stannis clearly placed great trust in the Red Woman's visions. In truth, Margaery's faith in the Seven stood at odds with Melisandre's worship. Yet if they both served the same king, perhaps the differences could remain in uneasy balance. She reminded herself of her vow, to secure Stannis's reign for the good of House Tyrell and for a chance at peace. If that meant coexisting with this unsettling Red Priestess, she would manage it with all the grace she could muster. Reaching her own chambers, she summoned a handmaiden to help her change into riding clothes. She wanted to ride out into the city proper, to see with her own eyes how the common folk fared after the battle. It was a risk. Her status made her a potential target, but she believed strongly in being seen. Nothing stoked goodwill quite like a queen showing personal care for her subjects. Soon, she was astride a gentle mare, flanked by 4 Tyrell knights for protection. They exited the Red Keep and made their way through the dusty streets. The aftermath of battle still weighed heavily on King's Landing. Though the fight had been largely outside the walls, the city had heard the thunder of cavalry and the clash of steel as though it rang in every alley. People wore drawn, anxious faces. Some stalls in the markets lay empty, their owners perhaps among the wounded, or afraid to resume trade. When Margaery entered the lower market district, a hush spread. Citizens turned, wide-eyed, as they recognized the Queen's standard and the rose sigil on her knights. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Many knelt awkwardly on the muddy ground, uncertain whether to cheer or remain silent. Margaery dismounted, beckoning them to rise. "Please," she said gently, "I only wish to see how you fare." The battle was difficult for us all. A few older women, wearing threadbare cloaks, dared to approach. They bobbed quick curtsies, then poured out a litany of worries. Their men had marched to fight, or had been conscripted, or they could not find enough food to feed their children. Margaery listened patiently, nodding in sympathy, making quiet promises that she would look into every concern. She felt their desperation as though it were a physical force pressing on her chest. One of her knights, a seasoned man named Ser Tyrell, offered that they had distributed bread at the city gates. "We've more set aside. If these good people go to the September by midday, there'll be fresh loaves and hot porridge from the Queen's stores." This news sparked a small wave of relief. Margaery thanked Ser Tyrell and addressed the gathered folk, urging them to go to the designated distribution points. She also mentioned that more supplies would arrive soon. She prayed that wasn't an empty promise. House Tyrell had brought provisions, but the city's population was enormous, and the siege, even if it had been brief, had strained every resource. As she walked further through the market, she saw a group of children huddled near a tavern's shuttered door. Their clothes were ragged, their cheeks hollow. One peered up with a mixture of awe and fear. Margaery paused, kneeling down to speak to them gently, asking if they had families, if they needed help. They mumbled that their parents had been killed in earlier riots or sickness, leaving them to fend for themselves. Her heart twisted at the sight. She reached into a pouch at her belt, giving them small coins and urging them to find the sisters at the city's orphan shelter. The gratitude in those young eyes reminded her why she tried so hard. A queen's power extended beyond forging alliances with great lords or winning battles. If they could not protect the vulnerable, what was the point of a crown? Her presence drew more onlookers, though most kept a respectful distance. Now and again, a brave soul would approach to beg for a hearing, and Margaery granted it if time permitted. Some complaints were small, broken roofs, missing livestock, but they mattered greatly to the people who lived with them. She answered as best she could, promising to inform the bailiffs or city officials to address the matters. The knights at her side seemed uneasy, scanning the crowd for threats. Yet no harm befell her. Instead, a fragile hope began to form in the eyes of the common folk. Perhaps they saw in her the potential for a kinder rulership than what Joffrey or Cersei had offered. Eventually, she mounted her horse again and rode toward the city's western gate, near where the battlefield still bore fresh scars. The gatehouse was heavily guarded. The knight captain there bowed on seeing her approach. Beyond the walls, a swath of churned earth and trampled grass revealed where men had clashed and died. Margaery felt her stomach knot at the sight of crows circling. Even from this distance, the faint stench of death reached her. Guards and soldiers were busy constructing pyres for the slain who had no family to claim them. Margaery closed her eyes briefly, then dismounted. She walked forward with a solemn step, the knights forming a respectful escort. A handful of silent sisters moved amid the fallen, draped in gray, their faces veiled. They wrapped bodies in cloth, chanting soft prayers. Margaery bowed her head, murmuring a prayer of her own. The swirl of crows took to the sky with an annoyed caw, as though resentful at being disturbed. She recognized the tabard of a Lannister soldier on one of the corpses, torn from a spear thrust. It reminded her that all these dead men had families, loyalties, histories. She felt a pang of guilt, though the war was not of her making. She was part of it now, entangled in the game that devoured so many lives. If she could end it, if she could help Stannis end it, that was her duty and her absolution. A silent sister approached, bowing wordlessly. In her arms, she carried a child's body, perhaps a young squire, no older than 12 or 13. Margaery's breath caught. The silent sister gently placed the child upon a cloth and began to wrap him. Margaery knelt, tears pricking her eyes. "You deserved better," she whispered, though she doubted the dead could hear. "All of you deserved better." Her knights hovered nearby, unsure if they should intervene, but they let her be. At length, she stood, brushed the dust from her skirt, and walked back toward her horse. Her soul felt heavy. So many tragedies lay at the root of this conflict. Yet for all the sorrow, she could not let despair overwhelm her. The realm depended on leaders who did not bow to grief. Riding back into the city, She resolved that the memory of these needless deaths would guide her. She would push for a swift end to the war, not a drawn-out campaign of vengeance. Stannis might thirst for justice, but she would show him how mercy and reconciliation could strengthen his claim, not weaken it. So she planned, shaping arguments in her head, preparing for the next council. Her return to the Red Keep was marked by a subdued hush, as if the massive fortress shared her mournful mood. She dismounted in the courtyard and handed the reins to a groom. As she made her way into the castle, she caught sight of Davos Seaworth emerging from the gates, likely off on some errand for the king. He saw her and paused, offering a small smile. "Your Grace," he greeted. "Out in the city, were you?" She nodded. "Yes, the people are in need as always, but there is gratitude as well for victory, for the presence of stability, however fragile." Davos nodded thoughtfully, hand drifting to the pouch at his belt where he kept the bones of his fingers. "Stability, that's what we all crave, I think. If we can secure that, perhaps the rest will follow." Margaery studied his lined face, seeing an earnestness that was rare in court. "You have always been honest, Ser Davos. Thank you for serving my husband faithfully." His cheeks colored slightly. "I do only what I feel is right, Your Grace. King Stannis saved my life in more ways than one. I'll stand by him as long as I'm able." She inclined her head. "We're fortunate to have you. Good luck on your errand." With that, she continued on her way, Davos heading in the opposite direction to mount his horse. Once inside, Margaery withdrew to a small solar reserved for the Queen's use. A single window let in pale light, and a vase of flowers, imported from the Reach, brought a fleeting sense of home. She sank onto a cushioned bench, letting out a long breath. Her handmaiden soon approached, offering her a cup of cool water. Margaery sipped it, grateful for the refreshment, and asked for a moment's privacy. When the handmaiden departed, Margaery let her gaze wander to the tapestry on the wall, depicting the Age of Heroes. It reminded her that Westeros had always been shaped by legends and bloodshed, by kings and queens forging ephemeral triumphs out of chaos. In that sense, her story with Stannis was another thread in a tapestry woven across centuries. She sat there, quietly reflecting on how she might turn the tide toward peace instead of unending war, how she might soften the edges of Stannis's iron will without undermining his resolve. A balance, delicate as a single drop of dew on a rose. If she failed, the realm might plunge into further bloodshed. If she succeeded, the Seven Kingdoms might at last breathe freely. A knock at the door broke her reverie. She composed herself and called for the person to enter. It was one of the city's bailiffs, a short man with a nervous disposition. He bowed stiffly, wringing his cap between his hands. "Your Grace," he began, "there's talk in the lower city. Some men are stirring up trouble, they say, claiming King Stannis is no true king, that Tommen was the rightful heir. They're riling the crowds, trying to incite them against us." Margaery's lips thinned. "Have they resorted to violence?" The bailiff grimaced. "Not yet, but the talk is ugly. If it spreads, it could lead to riots." She considered. "We cannot simply silence them by force. That would play into their narrative that we are tyrants. Speak with the gold cloaks. Increase patrols, but instruct them to maintain order without undue violence." The bailiff bobbed his head. "Yes, Your Grace. And if the men attempt to gather and march?" Margaery's expression hardened. "If they break the peace, arrests may be necessary, but try to isolate the ringleaders. Most of the small folk are simply frustrated and afraid. We must not punish them unjustly." He bowed again. "As you command, Your Grace. I'll see to it at once." When he left, Margaery pressed her palms against the bench. Another challenge, another spark that could catch fire if mishandled. She would need to coordinate with Stannis, though she knew he had little patience for rabble-rousers. Perhaps Davos could help mediate. She sighed, standing. Duty called her in 100 directions, each critical in its own way. In the corridors beyond, she heard a distant clamor, footsteps, excited voices. She followed the sound, rounding a corner to see a messenger breathless and panting outside the hand solar. where Davos usually worked. As she approached, the messenger blurted news that the scouts had returned. They carried word of Lannister movements west of the city. Margaery's pulse quickened. She needed to hear this. She stepped into the solar behind the messenger. Davos and a few Baratheon bannermen were already there, gathered around a table strewn with maps. The messenger handed over a parchment, stammering that the Lannisters were regrouping near the Gold Road, possibly hoping to muster a new army. Davos unrolled the parchment, scanning it. They're still weaker than before, but if they can gather enough loyalists from the Western Lords, they might pose a threat again. A bannerman cursed under his breath. "We should press our advantage, Ser Davos, your grace," he added, noting Margaery. "Drive them back to Casterly Rock. Force their surrender." Margaery frowned. An all-out assault on the west would demand a massive shift of troops, and leave King's Landing vulnerable again. Would that not spread our lines too thin? King Stannis just fought a hard battle. Marching west could provoke a prolonged campaign. Davos nodded. "Aye, that's true. We must counsel caution. But we also can't let them recover their strength." Margaery glanced at the maps, thinking of how far the gold mines of the west extended, and how the Lannisters might use their remaining wealth to hire sellswords or bribe alliances. Perhaps we should send envoys to the Tullis in the Riverlands, or the Blackwoods, or other houses that might resist Lannister expansion. If they pin the Lannisters down, we could avoid risking our entire army in a long campaign. Davos rubbed his jaw. It could work, especially if those houses see Stannis as a surer path to peace. "Let me speak with the king about it." Margaery offered a thoughtful nod. "Yes, he'll want to weigh every option. But time may be short. Once the Lannisters regroup, they could act swiftly." The men continued discussing possible strategies, referencing which houses might be swayed. Margaery stayed a moment longer, then excused herself. She intended to find Stannis, to ensure he heard about the scouts' reports directly. Yet as she made her way through the winding corridors, she was intercepted by another messenger, this one from Highgarden, bearing a letter sealed with her grandmother's personal crest. He handed it over with a bow, then departed. Margaery opened it, scanning the lines written in Olenna's sharp, concise script. The letter spoke of developments in the Reach, some lesser lords unsettled by Margaery's alliance with Stannis, others that had fallen in line after hearing of the victory at King's Landing. Olenna requested more updates, more reassurances of how the war would progress. A postscript mentioned the possibility of a betrothal for a distant Tyrell cousin to a Baratheon bannerman, further binding the two houses. Tucking the letter away, Margaery moved on. She found Stannis in the courtyard, talking to a cluster of knights about reinforcing the city gates. His brow was furrowed, and his mouth set in a thin line. When he spotted her, he dismissed the knights. She approached, inclining her head. "You've heard the scouts' reports, I trust?" she asked. He nodded, eyes flicking with irritation. "Yes, we've no respite, it seems. The Lannisters refuse to lie down." "Of course they do. They've been powerful for generations. They won't let one defeat break them." She took a breath. "But perhaps we can find a way to prevent a drawn-out campaign. There are lords in the Riverlands, the Westerlands even, who hold grudges against the Lannisters. If we ally with them," he cut in, voice taut, "allies who come to us only when we win. They are the type to abandon us the moment we stumble." Margaery touched his arm lightly, urging a more measured tone. "Yet, if we refuse them, we may have to fight on multiple fronts. Our men are exhausted, Stannis. You saw them. The city has barely begun to recover from the last siege. A purely military approach might cost thousands more lives." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then sighed. "You speak reason. We'll explore all avenues. Still, we must be ready to march if negotiations fail. I will not let the Lannisters retake King's Landing." She nodded firmly. "Nor will I. Let's gather the council again. We can dispatch envoys under Davos's guidance. If that fails, we'll plan for a western campaign. Either way, we stay ahead of the Lannisters." Stannis's grim expression eased a fraction. "So be it." They stood there for a moment, the wind stirring the courtyard. Around them, life went on. Servants passing, knights escorting lords. The realm might be in turmoil, but the Red Keep still bustled like a small city within walls of pale stone. Margaery thought of all the tasks yet undone, of the swirling chaos they had to manage. But with a shared understanding in Stannis' eyes, she felt that they stood as partners, each bringing their strengths. That night, a storm blew in from Blackwater Bay, drenching the city in sheets of cold rain. Margaery watched it from a high window, the lightning revealing the distant silhouette of the battered battlefield. The storm's roar reminded her of the precarious nature of their hold on power. Storms pass, but new ones always follow. Her marriage, this alliance, was an evolving story. She prayed that the next dawn would bring them closer to unity, or at least to a path that spared the realm from endless carnage. In the days that followed, the castle bustled with diplomatic efforts. Davos departed on a mission to treat with certain river lords who had parted ways with the Lannisters. Letters flew to and from Highgarden, to the Stormlands, and across the Crownlands as well. Mace Tyrell took it upon himself to parade through King's Landing with small contingents of knights, proclaiming the greatness of King Stannis and House Tyrell, relishing the adoration of those who enjoyed the spectacle. Margaery cringed at some of his excesses but recognized that it boosted morale. The people saw triumphant knights and gleaned a sense of security. Let them have a little pageantry, so long as it did not empty the coffers or incite new troubles. Meanwhile, Margaery maintained her outreach to the small folk. She visited orphans and widows, ensuring they had bread and blankets, listening to their woes. Whenever possible, she brought news of the realm's progress, offering assurance that the recent battle had been won decisively. She knew rumor traveled faster than truth, so she strove to fill the city's ears with stories of how Stannis, aided by Tyrell might, had bested the Lannisters, how they were not tyrants but guardians of order. Yet within the castle, certain tensions simmered. Melisandre's presence was never far from Stannis, and Margaery felt the priestess's watchful eyes. Olenna Tyrell, for her part, tolerated the Red Woman's closeness with all the graciousness of a cat forced to share space with a snake. Margaery often played mediator, ensuring no open conflict broke out. She found herself reminding her grandmother that insulting the priestess too openly could offend the king, while also reminding Stannis that the faith of the Seven was paramount to many lords and small folk. A delicate dance that left her exhausted in spirit. One late evening, after a day of hearing petitions and conferring with the king, Margaery retired to her chamber. The corridor was quiet, lit by a few flickering torches. As she walked, she passed the open door of the small sept within the Red Keep. From within came a soft glow of candles. Drawn by a sudden need for reflection, she stepped inside. The sept was empty. Tall statues of the Seven loomed. The father, the mother, the maiden, the crone, the warrior, the smith, and the stranger. Margaery moved to the altar, hands clasped before her. She knelt on a cushion, letting the hush settle around her. Images of the battlefield lingered in her mind, of the child squire who died, of the orphan children in the streets. The weight of responsibility pressed on her anew. Quietly, she prayed for guidance, for wisdom to help Stannis steer the realm toward peace, for the strength to persevere in a marriage that was as much a political bond as a personal one. She prayed for her brother's safety, for her father's ambition not to lead them astray, and for the small folk who suffered in every war, no matter the victor. The sound of footsteps behind her made her glance over her shoulder. To her surprise, it was Stannis. He paused by the doorway, looking ill at ease in this place of the Seven. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped forward, the torchlight revealing the strain on his face. "You come here often?" he asked in a low voice. "Sometimes," Margaery said, rising to her feet, "when I need a moment of peace." He looked at the statues, his gaze lingering on the father with a stern frown. "Peace. The realm has precious little of that." She offered a gentle smile. "That's why I pray for it, my king." Stannis made a small, uncertain gesture, as though he didn't know what to do with his hands in this sacred space. "Do you think your Seven watch over us, truly?" Margaery studied him. "I believe the gods watch. Whether they interfere or not, I cannot say. But faith offers comfort. His brow furrowed. Melisandre says the world is a battleground between the Lord of Light and the Great Other. She believes in her visions, in fire's prophecy. Margaery's voice remained calm. Faith comes in many forms, Stannis. If her faith empowers you, and mine comforts me, perhaps both can coexist. We want the same end, a realm safe from darkness. He exhaled, glancing again at the statues. I was raised to the Seven once, but I saw no miracles in all my years. Then Melisandre showed me things I cannot deny. Yet I do not begrudge you your devotion, Margaery. She inclined her head, stepping closer. I appreciate that, and I do not deny the power you've witnessed. Perhaps our gods are different faces of the same truth, or perhaps not. In any case, we share a mortal world with mortal problems. We must solve them together. He held her gaze in the candlelight. Something in his eyes softened, and he reached out, taking her hand in his, a gesture that felt surprising in its intimacy. You give me counsel that no other would dare. I value that, even if I do not always show it. Margaery let her fingers curl around his. I'm grateful to hear it. I only wish to serve you and the realm in the best way possible. A hush fell between them. The sept's dim light cast shadows on the statues, so that it seemed the seven themselves bore silent witness. Margaery's heart pounded. Here they were, a king and queen bound by necessity, forging a bond that might endure. She could almost imagine a path forward, one in which the war ended, the kingdom healed, and perhaps even they found a measure of harmony in each other's company. Gently, she withdrew her hand. I won't keep you, my king. I know you have many duties. I only ask that you consider mercy in your decisions as much as you consider justice. Stannis nodded slowly. Mercy, he echoed. Yes, I'll consider it. With that, he turned and left the sept, footsteps echoing in the hall. Margaery lingered a moment longer, heart fluttering from the rare closeness they had just shared. Then she, too, departed, slipping into the corridor with renewed resolve. The days became weeks, and King's Landing gradually stabilized under Stannis's rule, bolstered by Tyrell influence. Word came that certain Western lords, House Reyne's remnants notwithstanding, for the Reynes had long been destroyed, were reluctant to stand with the battered Lannisters. Others might still hold out. Meanwhile, in the north, rumors circulated of Bolton treachery, while the Greyjoys raided the coasts. Dorne remained aloof, as ever, a land unto itself. Amid all this, Margaery persisted in her role as queen, straddling the line between charity and diplomacy, ensuring that those who approached the throne found a listening ear if they came in peace. She corresponded frequently with her grandmother, orchestrating small alliances that might avoid further bloodshed. Stannis, while focused on the war effort, gave her the space to handle domestic matters. Now and then, he asked for her thoughts on issues of taxation or city infrastructure, a sign of growing trust or at least acknowledgement of her talents. In time, Davos returned from the Riverlands with news that several houses had agreed to pledge fealty to King Stannis, provided they were granted certain concessions and protection from Lannister retaliation. Stannis grimaced at the list of demands but ultimately agreed that forging alliances was worth some compromise. So the Ravenflights continued, carrying sealed letters of negotiation. Each letter brought the realm one step closer to unification, though always under the looming shadow of possible betrayal. One evening, as Margaery prepared for a modest supper with Stannis, a messenger burst into the solar, breathless and alarmed. He carried a dispatch from the west, reports that a new Lannister force, bolstered by Sells-words, was making a bold push toward the Rose Road. If they succeeded, they could potentially cut off supplies from the Reach, strangling King's Landing. Stannis, upon hearing this, clenched his jaw. So it begins again. Gather the lords. We must plan our defense. Margaery felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Another threat, another battle. The cycle continued. Should we not attempt to negotiate with them before steel meets steel? Stannis shook his head. They won't negotiate. This is a power play to starve the city. They must be met in open field or broken before they even reach the Rose Road. Mace Tyrell, upon hearing the news, bellowed that he would lead an army of reachmen to crush the Lannister host. Olenna arched an eyebrow but did not oppose him openly. Plans were drawn up. A swift mobilization of Tyrell cavalry and Baratheon troops, aiming to intercept the Lannisters on ground favorable to them. Once more, King's Landing braced for the tumult of war. On the eve of the departure, Margaery found herself alone on the balcony that overlooked the city. She gripped the balustrade, gazing out at the sprawl of rooftops and the flicker of lanterns in the twilight. She pictured the men mustering in the musty barracks, the knights polishing their armor, the stable boys saddling war horses. Soon they would ride out, uncertain if they would return. So many lives hinged on decisions made within these stone walls. A familiar presence stepped beside her, heavy footsteps on the balcony's tiles. Stannis. He stood with hands clasped behind his back, scanning the city as well. "You go to war again," Margaery said softly. He nodded. "Yes, the Lannisters leave us no choice. Mace Tyrell will ride at dawn. I'll join them a few days behind with our main force, once the city's defenses are secured." Margaery turned to face him, her voice trembling with concern. "Be careful, Stannis. Each battle takes a toll on you on the realm. Win if you must, but remember we do not seek endless bloodshed." His eyes flicked to hers. "I fight so that eventually we need fight no more." She swallowed, stepping closer. "And I will keep this city safe in your absence. I will ensure the people know why we fight, that we do not abandon them to fear or want." He nodded once, and in a gesture both surprising and oddly tender, he lifted a hand to cup her cheek. "Do so. For if we fail to hold the heart of the realm, it won't matter how many battles we win. The people make the kingdom." Margaery felt warmth surge in her chest. She leaned slightly into his touch, letting her eyelids drift shut for a moment. Then she opened them, meeting his steady gaze. "I promise," she whispered, "I will not fail you." Nor would she fail the dream she harbored. A dream of a united Westeros, rid of the petty horrors that had plagued it under weak or vicious rulers. She might have once believed in chivalric romance, in a gallant king who would sweep her off her feet. Now she believed in resilience, in forging alliances that could outlast war, in protecting those who could not protect themselves. Early dawn saw Mace Tyrell's host departing, standards high, horses snorting in the cool morning air. Margaery watched from the gates, giving her father a measured farewell. He declared he would return triumphant, that the Lannisters would fall before Tyrell's steel. She hoped his bravado could be matched by strategy. Stannis stayed behind a short while longer, ensuring the city was well garrisoned, then prepared to ride out with the main force. Before he left, he ascended to the ramparts where Margaery waited. He said nothing at first, only surveyed the rolling hills, the banners disappearing to the horizon. At length, he addressed her in a voice that carried a hint of private confidence. "We cannot lose, Margaery. If the Rose Road is blocked, the city will starve. Everything hinges on this campaign." She reached out, allowing her fingertips to brush his gauntlet hand. "Then ride swift and strike hard. The Tyrells are fierce when defending their lands. You'll have them at your side." He looked down at her hand, then met her gaze. "Pray for a short battle, for minimal bloodshed." "I will," she whispered. Then he inclined his head, turned, and strode away to mount his waiting horse. Margaery stood on the battlements, her heart pounding as she watched him lead the Baratheon soldiers out. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though no storm clouds marred the sky. An omen or a mere echo of distant artillery practice, she couldn't say. The realm teetered on a knife's edge, with House Tyrell and House Baratheon striving to maintain balance. She could only cling to the hope that her efforts at home would bear fruit, that the city would not crumble under the weight of fear, and that Stannis would return to her, alive, to continue the path they had begun together. She lingered until the host was gone from sight, swallowed by the vast roads and the uncertain days ahead. Then she descended the stairs, summoning all her composure. There would be no respite for her, no gentle lull. The city needed its queen, and she would answer that call with every ounce of resolve in her being. A new chapter in the war was opening, and only the gods knew how it might end. But Margaery Tyrell Baratheon would face it unflinching, a rose standing tall in the midst of storms.